Shabbat Shalom. And Moadim L'Simcha, it's Sukkot, because it is a special Shabbat in that we're layering holiness as the holiday, and because it is Shabbat, I want to dedicate our learning today. And the sages have taught us that there's a difference between learning and learning that is prayer. Learning is when we listen and we're passive. But for those instances in the learning when we engage, when it touches us, when we're involved for that instant, it turns it into a prayer. And so our learning of Torah together is actually moments of prayer that we are weaving together. And today, because we are layering holiness, I want to dedicate our learning because it is a prayer and we can dedicate our prayers. So I'd like to dedicate the learning that we're going to engage in together now and all day long, the moments that we do engage, for everyone on our Mishaberach list, and for Meir, who's part of our minyan, who I know wants to be in the room with us, that all of our learning should go to strengthen them, to give them the support that they need, that extra bit to get them to a point of full recovery, health, and ability to rejoin the community and rejoin us in our building, in our room, in our minyan, and fully with our prayers. So I want to talk about dancing the hora. We've all danced a hora. We've all been at some point where we just get up together in a circle on a dance floor, dancing the hora together, round and round and round and round and round. And we first learned it as the Mayim dance. And we would go, and everyone knows the tune, and we would all sing the words, Shoftem Mayim Bisason, Mimai Neha Yeshua, Mayim, 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 Mayim. That's when you go in, clap, hey Mayim Bisason, you come out of the circle. And the words in English are that you will draw water in joy from the waters of salvation. Water, 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 hey, water, water. It's not complicated. The words are very simple. We go round and round and round. It's actually one of the most simple things. And we get so involved in it, almost as a mantra, that keeps us moving and keeps us celebrating, that we don't really stop and ask ourselves, what are we saying? Where does that come from? Why is that becoming the focal point of our happiness, that we're actually rejoicing and dancing together at a simcha that is a different milestone, whether it's someone having a bar or bat mitzvah, whether it's a wedding, it doesn't matter. We're just going to dance to the Mayim song, and we're all going to celebrate the water. And actually today, in the middle of Sukkot, we're able to track it, and we're able to understand how we got here. Because in the holiday of Sukkot, every evening, we would engage in festival celebrations in the temple in Jerusalem that were called Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which is the joy, the happiness of the house of drawing the water. And it was the time in the year when we engaged in water libations. Everybody would go to one particular water source in Jerusalem, and remember, Jerusalem is in a desert, so water is not taken for granted and not easy. We would all go to that one water source, draw from there, and then bring the water through a chain of all of us to the temple to engage in water libations, which are exactly what it sounds like, pouring water. And we would just get the water going and moving from one part of Jerusalem up to the temple. Remember, the temple is on the mount, so it's the highest part. So we're bringing water up, which is always a challenge. And engaged in that, we're moving the water up to the highest point and then pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring. And it becomes this idea of water flowing endlessly from the bottom point to the high point, which again we know is not the natural way of water. Water will flow the opposite way, from the heights to the bottom part. And we're doing this, and we get a description in the Talmud from the rabbis that it is an astounding moment, that when we engage in this celebration of the water libations, it is an astounding moment of ongoing music, ongoing dancing, ongoing singing in the extreme. And I say in the extreme because they describe that the sages would come, light torches, and juggle them. They would stand there with lit torches and juggle them in the air during the water libations. And remember, fire, water. So they're deliberately bringing these things that should be in opposition, and they're uniting them into this incredible moment of unbridled joy. In fact, the Talmud tells us specifically Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would juggle 8 lit torches and never let one touch the other and never let any of them drop. I definitely want to be standing there watching that when that happens. It is truly an incredible description of joy that we can't even begin to understand. And I dare say that if we were juggling lit torches in shuls today, there would be a lot of people who would just come to see what that has to look like, because it's the last thing we expect to go on in a ritual. And yet we're being told not only did it go on, but it was absolutely the height of what was happening there. They also tell us in the Talmud that anyone who hasn't seen the joy of Simchat Beit HaShoeva has never experienced joy at all. That's the Talmud's way of saying, you don't know from fun. You should come see what we do for fun. This is what we're talking about when we talk about joy. If you haven't seen this, you don't know from parties. And it's an incredible statement, again, that we do not expect. And here's the part that is really unusual. It's the only time the Talmud tells us we separated men and women in the temple. Only in Simchat Beit HaShoeva were men and women put on other sides, not blended together, but separated during this festival. When we look back and we try to understand the seating of prayer today in Judaism, the history of how we've sat. When have we been separated? How have we been separated? Were we separated just by sitting apart? Were we separated because we put a wall between us? Were we separated because men were on the floor and women were up in the balcony? How did all this happen? Where did we all get there? And we're trying to track it. And oftentimes, I've seen it try to track back to Simchat Beit HaShoeva, because the Talmud tells us men and women were separated. Except, that's not what it was saying. It was saying men and women were separated for this, which now gives us the understanding they were not separated for other things. They were specifically only separated for this celebration. We're told that in the temple on Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the men would be on one side, the women would be on the other side, the Levites were in the middle. Because the Levites are doing all the singing and the musical instruments and getting the party going and getting all the joy going. They're in the middle. They're equally accessible to the men, equally accessible to the women. And that's crucial because we're talking about access to the holy. And if we're going to separate people, we never want to create barriers of access to the holy. There should always be equal access. It should always be open doors with an invite. So the question becomes, well, if they're not separating for other times, why are they separating here? What's going on here that is becoming so important? And then we think back again. Water. Water libations. The water is pouring. The water is splashing. Everybody is carrying water. Everybody is pouring water. And we all know what happens when we engage with water. With our clothes, that water is going to make those clothes cling to us. And it's going to cause people to hesitate to engage because issues of modesty, issues of privacy, and rightly so. It would be inappropriate. So how are we going to protect the holiness of the moment and protect the holiness of the individual and our privacy and our dignity and our integrity? And the rabbis say, separate, so you're not worried about it. It didn't have anything to do with what we thought it had to do with. It has to do with heightening the holiness on both sides. We're protecting the people, and so separating them into two. We want people to engage with their spirituality and not worry that they might be vulnerable at this moment, or people might be looking at them for other reasons. We don't want to worry about it. We'll just separate them out, and we'll put holy in between, and everybody now has access to it. However, from there, we end up with separation of exclusion. Once that happens and exile hits, and we're out of Israel now, and we're in the rest of the world, And Judaism creates permeable lenses for us, permeable filters. We see what's going on in the other cultures. And we're supposed to bring the ones in that enhance our values and enhance our moment, and then the ones that don't, we're supposed to leave out. That's how it works for us in exile. So we entered exile, and now we looked at the cultural norms around us. And what people don't often realize is that the separation of men and women in shuls is because we were imitating the churches of Europe. The churches in Europe separated men and women. They had men on one side, women on the other side. Often the children, if they were at all welcome, were sitting in a balcony away. And so synagogues began to be built along those models. And many of the synagogues were built without even having room for women to come. It was only men that were there. And what started to happen is that we start to get the reasoning that we hear behind it. Well, women aren't obligated to prayer, so therefore, if we only have a set budget in the community, we don't need to set aside funds to build a room for women. Women aren't obligated for prayer. So now we're hearing the practical reasoning about why we're going to exclude and block access to the holy. And then from there, we move on to an argument of, well, the women could distract the men, and the men do have an obligation. Therefore, we're not going to have room for the women, and now what we hear is we hear the ritual reasoning about starting to put barriers to access to the holy. And then we hear into the modern age that women are higher spiritually than men. Women don't need to pray because their souls are elevated already, and therefore, we don't have to worry about the women. And now what we're listening to is we're listening to the holiness reasoning. And all of these are reasons to restrict access to the holy, which the Talmud told us we should never do. And so we arrive at a place where we're just trying to make sense of it. And when we look back and we say, all right, so how did we end up from there to actually having what we call mixed seating? Well, once again, it first happens in America because American Jews are imitating the churches of New England. New England innovated what they called family seating. Not mixed seating, but the idea that families could sit together in groups. If you were single, you were not sitting together. But families were allowed to sit together. And the shuls in New England began to copy that. And it first started in the Reform movement, and from there moved throughout much of Judaism. But what we see happening is we begin to fight over it internally. We think that somehow, whether we're sitting together or we're not sitting together, is the defining difference between our communities. It isn't. The communities are fighting politically over who will have the authority to make decisions. And then we just zero in on this one thing. The problem is that it's really not something we can track meaningfully. We can't find it in text because it's not there. We can't find it as the defining moment because it isn't. It's an influence that came in and then worked its way through, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on with it by giving all these reasonings to somehow give it meaning. That's from the top down. That's when we see the leadership arguing about it and the leadership trying to jostle for control and who's going to be the ones that make the decisions about Jewish law. But what's happening with the people? Because we know that that is our way, is that we have leadership top down and we have the voice of the people that permeates up to the leaders. When we look at what's happening with the people, we understand that people are saying this can be meaningful, if not historic. It's another way of expressing how we create holy space. Some people have said that they feel that men and women create holy space differently. So there should be the possibility for women to sit together and create holy space that way, for men to sit together, create holy space that way. But there are other people who say, I create holy space with my family. So I want to sit with my family and create holy space that way. There are some people who create holy space when they sit alone and they're not distracted, and they can journey inward, and they don't want to be part of larger. So they create holy space on their own, and there are others who create holy space when they connect to nature, and you'll usually see those people sitting by a window, and they're sitting in shul, but they're gazing outside. Everybody is creating holy space in a meaningful way, and that's exactly what should be happening, are all those choices, because the goal has never been, let's figure out if we're sitting together or not. The goal has always been, how do we create holy space and then create access to the holy for everyone in the way that is meaningful for them. Often when we think of Judaism, we think about it as very serious. It's serious business. We have meaningful history, we have significance and meaning and heaviness, and everything has all of that attached to it. But Sukkot and Simchat Beit HaShoeva in particular reminds us that we have to choose our joyous moments within the rituals that we're doing. That's how we celebrate covenant. If ritual becomes oppressive, onerous, something I have to do, I really don't want to, then the answer is we're doing it wrong. Even if we're technically doing it right, we're actually doing it wrong, because it is supposed to be joyous from within the ritual. So all of us who have danced round and round at a simcha, repeating mayim, 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 water, 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 dancing and dancing and dancing, we are relishing in a moment shared with an ancient ritual of the water libations. It's a time when our leaders showed us the extreme joy our Judaism can bring to us. May we all enter a year of peace, abundance, and health. May we dance a hora or two with images of rabbis juggling torches in our midst. And may we learn to experience joy that has no limit. Shabbat Shalom.